The dust hadn't yet settled on the ruins of King's Landing when Arya Stark stood at the steps of the Red Keep, blood dried on her cheek and smoke curling from the ruins behind her. Jon Snow had walked into the hall hours ago to confront Daenerys, and now he was gone, no one knew where. Word travelled quickly in whispers. The Dragon Queen was dead, murdered. Her last dragon, broken by grief, had flown east with her body clutched in its talons, and just like that, Westeros was leaderless. Again, Arya hadn't meant to stay. She was never meant to rule, or even be part of the rebuilding. Her plan was clear: sail west, find out what lay beyond the edge of the world. But something shifted as she stood amid the ashes. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't pride. It was something colder, quieter, a sense of unfinished duty. She looked around and saw the faces of small folk kneeling to bury their dead with their bare hands, the frightened eyes of orphaned children, the smouldering bones of what once was. She thought of Ned. In the following days, the lords and ladies of Westeros were summoned once more to decide the future of the realm. Sansa, cold and clever, advocated for the North's independence and returned to Winterfell with her crown. Bran, now silent and strange, declined the throne when it was offered. Tyrion, haunted and bitter, sat in a cell awaiting his fate. No, one expected Arya to speak, but she did. "I don't want power," she had said. "But I'll take responsibility if no one else will." The hall had gone silent. Arya Stark, once a ghost, a nobody, the girl who vanished into myth, was now seated in the circle of lords, eyes sharp like Valyrian steel. She didn't smile. She didn't ask. She simply made it clear, if no one else had the courage to take what needed to be taken, she would. It wasn't a coronation that followed. It wasn't a parade of gold and flowers. There was no crown placed upon her head. Arya didn't wear silks or sit tall on the Iron Throne, not yet. But one by one, the Broken Realm's leaders agreed. Not because of politics, not because of legacy, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't, and because deep down they trusted her. She wasn't a Targaryen with dragons or a Lannister with lies. She was a Stark with scars. Arya accepted the throne the way a soldier accepts a sword, gripping it tight, knowing blood would follow. She walked through the broken halls of the Red Keep that night, stepping past shadows and memories. Every room reeked of old power, of betrayal and ghosts. And at last she stood before the melted wreckage of the Iron Throne. She didn't rebuild it. She didn't need to. She had a new one made, simple, sturdy, black wood and steel. Nothing that would inspire fear, but nothing that would bend either. The kind of throne a wolf would sit on, not a dragon, but not everyone approved. In the shadows, old names whispered again. Lannister, Hightower, Martell. They spoke of tradition, of bloodlines, of rightful heirs. They said Arya was no queen, that she ruled without elegance, that she killed too easily, trusted too little. They didn't understand what Arya already knew. Westeros didn't need elegance. It needed justice, and she had a list. Not all names had been crossed off. They came to test her. The lords who had bowed with forced smiles and hollow oaths. They returned, one by one, with veiled threats hidden behind trade disputes and political flattery. Arya could smell them from across the throne room. The stench of those who had survived every king and queen by switching sides just in time. Men who had smiled for Aerys, then Robert, then Joffrey, and then Daenerys. Now they smiled for her. She didn't smile back. The first to challenge her was Lord Harys Valar from the Reach. He arrived draped in gold and arrogance, bringing a caravan of food and wine as if to suggest the realm owed him for its survival. "Your Grace," he said, bowing just low enough to be noticed, but not enough to mean it. "The Reach fed the capital during your rise. We only ask for fair recognition, perhaps, say, an extension of our influence on the council." Arya leaned. Forward in her chair, not the iron throne, but the black steel seat carved with northern wolves on each side. "No," she said simply. He blinked. "My lady, perhaps you misunderstood." "I didn't," Arya interrupted, her voice steady. "You offered aid when the city burned, but only after it burned. That's not loyalty, that's opportunity." When he began to protest, Arya rose to her feet. She moved the way she always had, quiet as a cat, precise as a blade. She stepped down from the throne, closer, close enough to make him sweat. Her dagger, Needle's twin, forged in Valyrian steel, rested on her hip, the same steel that had once carved through a god of death. "I don't reward cowards," she said, "but you're welcome to leave with your tongue still in your mouth. For now." Lord Valar left that same day, red-faced and shaken. He never returned. Others watched. So Arya ruled with a different kind of power, not through speeches or parades, but with presence. A cold calm that made even seasoned knights avoid meeting her eyes. She didn't dress in finery. Her leathers were plain, her cloak dark. She held court not daily, but when needed. She listened, she judged, and when she sentenced, it was final. Her small council was unlike any Westeros had seen. Ser Davos returned as master of ships, loyal and honest, one of the few who could challenge her with truth and not suffer for it. Gendry, now Lord of Storm's End, came north often, and Arya made him master of arms, not because of affection, though some whispered it still lingered, but because he understood war and the men who fought it. Samwell Tarly came reluctantly, bringing books and logic, and Arya insisted he head the realm's education and healing programs. "Too many lords raise killers and call them sons," she told him. "Let's try something different." But not everyone agreed with her methods. In the shadows, rebellion brewed. The Riverlands had begun murmuring again. House Frey may have been destroyed, but resentment lingered like rot in the stone. The Vale's young Lord Arryn was now of age, and his advisers didn't take kindly to a queen with no noble children, no royal husband, and no interest in alliances. Tyrion still, imprisoned in the depths below the Red Keep, received her only once. She stood before his cell, watching him sip wine from a chipped cup. "You killed the Dragon Queen," he said without bitterness. "And now you rule. You've outplayed them all, little wolf." Arya tilted her head. "You still think this is a game?" He chuckled softly, bitterly. "Everything in Westeros is a game. Even you'll learn that soon." She stepped closer to the bars. "I don't play games, Lannister. I end them." He met her eyes, and for a moment, even Tyrion. Lannister looked unsure. Arya left the dungeons in silence. But his words clung to her. There were still enemies out there, quiet ones who wore smiles and nodded in council meetings while sending ravens behind closed doors. And Arya knew one truth clearer than any prophecy or tale. You don't sit the throne without spilling blood. You just choose whose. The raven came at midnight. Its wings were dusted with snow, its eyes black as ink. It bore no sigil, no wax seal, just a scrap of parchment tucked tight around its leg. Arya read it by candlelight, standing alone in her chambers. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. But something in her jaw tightened. The note was unsigned. But the message was clear. The North remembers, but not you. You wear a crown built on ashes, not honor. Soon winter comes for you, Arya Stark. It wasn't the first threat she'd received, but this one didn't feel like empty words. This one felt personal. That same morning, Ser Davos entered her council chamber carrying another report. 3 supply wagons from the Westerlands had vanished on their way to King's Landing. Scouts found the wrecks days later, the guards all dead, the supplies burned. No house claimed responsibility and no survivor could speak of the attackers. They moved like ghosts, one barely living guard whispered, like shadows in the snow. No banners, no mercy. Arya didn't need banners to know who was responsible, House Blackwood or maybe House Bracken. Maybe even the remains of House Frey, reborn in bastards and bandits. The truth didn't matter, the message did. Arya's rule was being tested, not by open war, but by slow, creeping sabotage. Her council urged restraint. Samwell recommended negotiation. We should send envoys, build trust. Perhaps they think you're not listening. I'm not here to be liked, Arya said. I'm here to keep the realm alive. She turned to Gendry. Pick 20 of your best. Track the ones who did this. Bring me names or bring me heads. He didn't argue. Not because he agreed, but because he knew better. Arya didn't ask twice. Yet even Gendry, who once shared a kind of soft space with her, had begun to look at her with something close to fear. Not because she was cruel, but because she never flinched, never wavered. Her heart had grown colder in the halls of power. Somewhere between the blade and the crown, Arya Stark had stopped being someone's little sister and become something far more dangerous, a ruler without a mask, a wolf without a leash. But the realm was watching, and the realm whispered, "She's not a queen, she's an assassin in a dress. She wears no crown. How do we know she's fit to lead? Does she even know what peace looks like?" Arya knew peace. She'd seen it once, in a tavern in Braavos, in the quiet sigh of the sea beyond the docks, in the way hot pie used to hum while baking. But peace had no place in the throne room, not yet. Still, the realm needed reassurance. So for the first time since her rise, Arya held a public audience in the square before the Red Keep. No armor, no weapons, just her, standing on the carved steps of the palace beneath the black and grey banner she had designed herself, 2 wolves running side by side across a field of broken chains. She didn't give a speech. Arya Stark never was one for words. She simply said, "I didn't come to rule. I came because no one else had the courage to do what needed to be done. I don't care for your songs or your titles. But if you want a queen who'll bleed for you, fight for you, kill for you, then you have her. If not, say it to my face, but don't hide behind ravens." For a moment, silence. Then a voice from the crowd shouted, "Long live the Wolf Queen!" Then another. Then dozens. Not a roar, not a wildfire of cheers, but something quieter. Respect, reluctant, but real. But not all were convinced. That same night, in the dark corridors of the Red Keep, a young squire tried to poison her meal. Arya caught him before the cup reached her lips. She didn't scream, didn't punish him in front of others. She simply pulled him into a room and asked, "Who sent you?" The boy shook, cried, refused to speak. Arya didn't need him to. She'd seen this before. In Braavos, in Harrenhal, in the House of Black and White, poison wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. And that message came from someone within the capital itself. The real rebellion wasn't coming from the Riverlands or the North. It was already inside her walls. The shadows of the Red Keep whispered louder than ever. Arya moved through the castle like she had all her life. Silent, watchful, unseen. She no longer wore the robes of royalty or the cloak of a monarch. That night, she wore leathers and quiet steps. She shed her title like skin, becoming what she once was, a ghost in the dark. The boy had been just a tool, trembling and terrified, far too young to be the hand behind such a bold move. But someone had put poison in that goblet. Someone who knew her habits, her hours, her guards, her routines. This wasn't the work of a stranger. It was someone close. She didn't summon her council. She didn't warn the castle. She simply disappeared into the night. Arya crept through kitchens and servant quarters, through council chambers and scribe halls. She watched, listened, waited, and what she saw made her colder than winter. Whispers in corners. Coins passed quietly, from cloaked figures to maids. A raven already penned and ready to fly before dawn, addressed to Old Town, sealed with no house sigil, but marked with a sun and spear watermark, faint in the wax. Dawn. Arya knew they had kept to themselves since Daenerys' fall, licking wounds and avoiding politics. But they hadn't forgotten the deaths that came with war, and they hadn't forgiven the crown, not even hers. She followed the trail to a name she hadn't thought about in months. Sir Rickon Vaelier, a knight from Sunspear. Charming, clever, recently appointed to her personal guard at the suggestion of one of the lords of the Reach. She had barely paid attention when he was sworn in. He smiled too much. She didn't like men who smiled that easily. Arya found him in the training yard, sparring with another guard. His form was perfect, too perfect. She waited until the others had left, then stepped into the torchlight. He turned, and his smile faltered. Just a flicker. Enough to confirm what she already knew. "My queen," he said, bowing. "Don't call me that," Arya replied, voice cold. They circled each other slowly, like wolves testing the air. "I hear poison's a Dornish favorite," she said casually, "but I thought even they had better taste than to use it on children." His fingers twitched near his sword, but he didn't draw. "Was it your idea, or did someone pay you?" He said nothing. Arya stepped closer. "I'm not Daenerys. I won't burn cities to prove a point. But I won't hesitate to end one man who thinks I'm blind." He moved then, fast, clean, efficient. But Arya had faced faster. She dodged, stepped in, drove her dagger into his side before he even registered the pain. He staggered, gasping, blood seeping through his armor. She whispered in his ear as he fell, "Tell your friends in Dawn, next time send someone better." She dragged his body to the center of the yard and left it there. At sunrise, the servants found it with a note pinned to his chest in her handwriting. "The wolf sees through masks." It was the message Westeros needed to see. Arya's justice wasn't loud or theatrical. It was swift, precise, unmistakable. But as the guards cleaned the blood and her council convened in a rush, Gendry stood across the room, eyes darker than usual. "You're not leaving any room for peace," he said quietly when they were alone. "I'm leaving room for survival," Arya replied. "There's a difference. You're becoming what you used to fight." She looked at him then, not the blacksmith, not the bastard Baratheon, but the man who had once seen her when no one else did. "And what should I become instead? Soft, forgiving, dead?" He didn't answer. Because they both knew, Arya Stark didn't come to sit the throne out of hunger for power. She came because there was no one left strong enough to keep the wolves from tearing each other apart. And now that rebellion was at her gates, and treachery had crept into her very home, Arya knew what she had to do. She would have to go north, back to where the wolves were born, because something was stirring beyond the wall, and it wasn't snow. The north greeted her with silence. Arya rode past the gates of Winterfell under a steel-grey sky, her cloak heavy with southern dust. The cold bit at her cheeks like an old warning. This was no ceremonial return, no welcome banners, no songs, only a scattering of men on the battlements and a distant howling wind. Sansa met her in the courtyard, crown on her head, wolves stitched in red on her robes. "You didn't send word," Sansa said. "I didn't need to," Arya replied. There was a long pause between them. Sisters by blood, rulers by duty, but they had become two different things. Arya saw it. In Sansa's eyes, calculation, caution, walls behind walls. The queen in the north wasn't a girl playing dress-up anymore. She was sharp and steady and suspicious. "I heard about the poisoning," Sansa said at last. "You think it came from here?" "No," Arya said, "but it might end here." They walked together in silence, past the Godswood, through halls they'd once played in. The ghosts were thick here, father, mother, Robb, Rickon, even Jon, though he still breathed somewhere beyond the frost. Sansa led her into the war room where Maester Corwin spread maps across the long oak table. "Rangers are disappearing," he said without looking up. 3 patrols gone missing. Last one was led by a man who's been ranging these woods for 20 years. No word, no bodies. Arya leaned over the map, tapping the edge of the frost fangs. "Here," she said. "If I were hiding something, I'd hide it in the place no one wants to go." Sansa watched her closely. "You think it's more than wildlings?" Arya didn't answer. Not yet, but something in her gut twisted like a blade. The quiet in the north wasn't natural. It was the quiet before something old and cruel returned. That night she rode beyond the wall. Only 2 companions went with. Her ghost, white as the snow and still loyal to the Stark name, and a silent ranger named Breck, whose loyalty came not from oaths but from fear. The rest of the men refused. Superstition had returned with the cold winds. The stories of the long night were being whispered again. "They say the dead don't rest anymore," Breck said, voice barely above the wind. Arya kept riding. The trees turned stranger as they rode deeper, bark like stretched skin, leaves shriveled, into black claws. Even Ghost, fearless and wild, growled low into the woods. They rode 3 days without fire. And then they found it, the bodies, hung upside down, skinned open, patterns carved into the snow around them. Not the work of wildlings, not even animals, ritualistic, ancient. Breck turned pale. "We should go back. This is old magic." But Arya stepped closer, narrowing her eyes at the sigils in the ice. They weren't runes. They weren't letters. They were faces, the faces of the dead. One of them was hers. She stared at it, unmoving. The face was carved into the ice, eyes hollow, mouth shut. Her face as it had been in the House of Black and White. A faceless girl. A warning left by something that remembered her. "We're being watched," she said. Ghost snarled. From the tree line, movement, shadows slithered between branches, too fast, too tall. Not men. Not quite. And then she saw them. Not White Walkers, not the dead, but something worse, things wearing faces that weren't theirs. Creatures made of ice and bone and mimicry. They didn't groan or howl. They simply stood there, hundreds of them, watching, waiting. Arya stepped back, dagger drawn. Breck didn't move. She looked at him. His eyes were solid white. She didn't even hesitate. The dagger went through his throat before he could speak. He crumpled to the snow, and from his mouth poured black mist. Ghost barked, teeth bared. "They were surrounded." Arya turned to run, but a voice came from behind her. "I warned you once. The dead don't forget." She spun, blade raised, but no one was there. Only wind, only snow, only the sound of the past clawing its way back to life. The storm hit as Arya ran. Not rain, not snow. Just wind, cutting, screaming wind that clawed. Through trees and tried to rip her from her saddle. Ghost ran beside her, blood-specked muzzle low, snarling at the shadows that twisted through the trees. The forest was alive with them, things that moved like smoke, flickered like torchlight, and wore stolen faces that smiled without joy. Arya didn't look back. Looking back meant doubt. Doubt meant death. They burst from the tree line just as the moon pierced through the clouds, and she urged her horse faster, hooves pounding the frozen ground toward the abandoned ranger tower at Icewatch Crag. It was old, half-fallen, but it had walls and more. Importantly, fire. She reached it just as one of the shadows lunged, catching her arm with claws that burned like frostbite. She spun, slashed with Valyrian steel. The thing didn't scream, it just shattered like glass struck by sunlight. Gone. In an instant, but more followed. She and Ghost fought their way into the tower, bolting the doors behind them. The wind shrieked like a living thing outside. Inside, the cold clung to the stone walls like rot. She found the old hearth and sparked flint to tinder, hands trembling, not with fear, but fury. Something had followed her back. Something remembered. She thought it had ended in Braavos, when she walked away from the House of Black and White, leaving her debts behind. But debts don't disappear, especially not in the language of death. As the fire flared to life, the room grew a fraction warmer, but the shadows danced still. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Inside, Arya stood, dagger ready, ghost pacing near a door. But what stepped from the corner wasn't one of the creatures, it was herself, or something that looked like her. Same eyes, same scars, same cold, hard stare. The other Arya tilted her head. "You thought you could run," it said. The voice was hers, but layered, warped, as if a dozen people were speaking beneath it. "You took faces, you borrowed death, but death remembers, it always remembers." Arya didn't blink. "I earned those faces, I paid in blood, and then you left." She lunged, steel met shadow. The mimic moved like her, fought like her, but without soul. It copied every move, every strike, but it didn't feel. Arya fought harder. She wasn't just dueling her past, she was killing it, again and again. Finally, she drove the dagger into its chest and twisted. The shadow let out a soundless cry and disintegrated, dissolving into smoke that fled through cracks in the stone. Breathing heavy, blood on her hands, Arya dropped to one knee. Ghost whined beside her. She wasn't alone. A whisper came from the corner of the tower, this time a different voice. Faceless ones walk again. An old man stepped into the firelight, cloaked in furs, beard like snowdrift, eyes milky and strange. I saw them once, long ago, beyond Braavos, beyond Valyria. The faces were not masks, they were memories, stolen, trapped. Arya rose, eyes sharp. "Who are you?" "I was once a priest," he said, "of the many-faced god, but I stopped worshipping when I learned the truth. They don't grant mercy. They feed," her stomach turned. "Feed on what? On us, our grief, our guilt. They follow those who run from their past." He looked at her like he already knew the truth. "You never let go of your faces, girl. You only buried them, but they remember you." Outside, the wind howled louder. The forest screamed with voices stolen from the dead. Arya knew what she had to do. She had to burn them. All of them. The faces, the masks, the place where it all began. She had to return to Braavos, but first she had to survive the night. And beyond that tower, the forest waited, full of ghosts, full of her. The fire burned low, and dawn bled grey through the cracks in the stone. Arya stood at the tower's edge, cloaked and silent, her eyes scanning the frostbitten horizon. The wind had calmed, but the stillness that followed felt unnatural. Ghost sat beside her, fur singed and breath rising in steam. Neither moved, neither spoke. The old priest was gone. No trace, no footprints in the snow, no heat where he'd sat, only the memory of his voice echoing in her skull like a curse. "They feed on us." Arya wasn't one to dwell on riddles, but something about those words clung to her, like the scent of blood long scrubbed from steel. She had spent her whole life surviving by becoming other people, by wearing death like armor. And now, death had come wearing her. She wrapped her fingers around the hilt of her dagger. The journey ahead wouldn't be one with a sword. It would be one with resolve. By midday, she reached the outpost at Deepwatch and sent word south. Sansa would hold the north. Davos would keep King's Landing steady. Gendry would understand. He always had. She didn't write much, just a line. "If I don't return, burn the old gods and the new. They all failed us." By nightfall, Arya was aboard a Braavosi vessel bound east, her name erased from the passenger list. The sea was calm, but her mind was not. With each wave, memories rose unbidden. Jaqen's smile, the smell of the black and white temple, the cold stone floor where she'd lain half dead after failing a test she never understood. She'd left Braavos thinking she was free. She was wrong. Thay, ship docked under a blood-orange sky. Braavos was unchanged. Misty canals, silent bridges, the looming titan watching all. But something beneath the surface had shifted. People moved quicker, doors were shut tighter, eyes darted behind masks. Fear. Had returned to the City of Shadows. Arya wore no disguise, no face but her own. Let them see her. She walked the same path she had taken years ago, past the canals, through the alleys, to the stone door of the House of Black and White. It opened before she touched it. Inside, the temple was cold. Candles flickered along the walls. The pool of poisoned water still shimmered in the center, and around it stood the statues of every god known to man, the stranger, the lion, the red woman, even the drowned god. Jaqen H'ghar stood in the shadows. He hadn't aged. Not a day. "You have returned," he said softly. "I didn't come to kneel," Arya replied. "I came to finish it." He stepped closer, head tilted, voice calm as ever. "A girl still thinks endings are hers to choose, but the gift was never yours. You borrowed it." "No," Arya said, pulling the cloth from her satchel. She dropped it. Dozens of faces spilled across the temple floor. The waif, the stable boy, the trader, the young girl with green eyes, the old man with a cough, all the lives she'd borrowed, all the people she had been. "I'm not yours," she said, "and I never was." Jaqen didn't flinch. "Then why do they follow you? Why do they wear your skin?" Arya took a step forward. "Because I'm the one who stole them." The walls trembled. The pool in the center began to bubble. From the shadows, figures emerged, warped copies of her past selves, half-formed and snarling, faces without souls, deaths without peace. "You cannot kill death," Jaqen whispered. "No," Arya said, drawing her steel, "but I can bury it." She stepped into the center of the temple, blade flashing, heart steady. Ghost lunged beside her, tearing through shadows with fang and fury. Each mimic that fell screamed in 100 voices, pleading, mocking, crying out in tongues lost to time. The last one, the waif, lunged at her in silence, but Arya didn't hesitate. One clean strike. Gone. As the last shadow dissolved, into ash, the pool turned black. Jaqen was gone. The temple began to crack, statues crumbled, the air itself felt thinner. She'd broken something ancient. She didn't care. Arya turned her back on the House of Black and White as it collapsed behind her. She walked out into the sunrise with blood on her hands, a wolf at her side, and peace, for the first time in years, in her chest. But peace never lasts in Westeros, not when you wear a crown. The wind that met her return was warmer than before. But the world felt colder. Arya stood at the docks of King's Landing again, just as she had once stood at the edge of the world, ready to vanish into myth. Now she came back not as a ghost, nor as the girl who'd worn too many faces. She came back as Arya Stark, no more, no less. The streets were quieter than she remembered. The city moved slower, more cautiously. Her return had been whispered days before she arrived, carried ahead by ravens and rumors. People bowed, some cheered, but many simply stared. They saw the blood on her cloak, the scars, the wolf beside her. They saw a queen who had stepped into the land of the dead and come back alive. Sansa was waiting for her in the throne room. She stood at the foot of Arya's throne, her face pale and composed, hands folded. "You went to Braavos," Sansa said. "I had to," Arya answered. "And now what?" Her sister's voice didn't waver. "You come back and expect to rule again? After vanishing in the middle of a storm?" Arya walked past her and climbed the steps to her throne, the blackwood seat carved with wolves and broken chains. "I didn't vanish," she said. "I ended it." Sansa narrowed her eyes. "Ended what?" "The past." That answer didn't satisfy her sister, but Arya didn't care. Some truths couldn't be spoken without inviting their return. What she saw in Braavos, what she fought, wasn't meant for the ears of politicians and lords. It was meant for someone like her, someone who knew death and didn't fear it anymore. Her small council entered next. Gendry, Samwell, Davos, even Brienne, summoned from Tarth. They all took their places. Sam leaned forward, voice cautious. "Your Grace," There have been stirrings in the Vale. Lord Arryn has refused your summons. He's raising men, calling it a defensive measure." Arya didn't flinch. "He wants the throne?" "He wants something," Braavos said. "There are whispers. He thinks you've brought something unnatural back with you," Gendry added. "They say your wolf glows in the dark." Arya actually smiled at that. "They said worse when Jon came back from the dead." Brienne frowned. "You're not going to kill him, are you?" Arya met her gaze. "If I do, it won't be murder. It'll be mercy." The room went silent. The old ways were dead. So were the old rules. Arya had no patience left for games. The days that followed were tense. The Vale remained defiant. Dawn was silent. The Riverlands murmured. But no army moved. No sword was drawn. They waited to see what Arya Stark would do. And that was. When she made her choice, she summoned every lord and lady remaining in Westeros. Not to war, not to threaten, but to witness. They gathered in the same courtyard where the Dragon Queen had once been crowned in ash. Arya stood before them with no crown, no sigil, no armor. Just her blade, her wolf, and the full weight of everything. She had become. "I won't rule you," she said, voice loud and clear. "Not like the kings and queens before. I won't keep this throne. I won't pass it down in blood. Murmurs. I've seen what happens when power sits still, when it rots on a chair made of fear. I don't want it." Gendry stepped forward, startled. "What are you saying?" Arya looked at them all. "I'm ending the monarchy." Gasps, protests, shock. But she continued. "Westeros won't kneel to a single ruler anymore. Each kingdom will rule itself. Together, we'll meet when needed, but no more crowns, no more dynasties. The Iron Throne is gone. And so is everything it ever stood for." The old bloodlines raged. The Reach shouted. The Vale nearly stormed. Out. But the people listened. The small folk whispered of her name not with fear, but with awe. The queen who gave away power. The wolf who broke the chain. That night, Arya walked the halls of the Red Keep one last time. She stopped at the window, overlooking the ruins, where dragons once soared and fire once fell. Gendry found her there. "You're really leaving?" he said. She nodded. "I was never meant to stay." "And where will you go now?" She turned to him, eyes soft but steady. "West," he smiled sadly. "You always wanted to see what was out there." "I still do." Ghost padded up beside her, tongue lolling, eyes calm. Her oldest companion, her truest friend. Without ceremony, without applause, Arya Stark left the Red Keep at dawn. No banners flew, no horns blew. She simply rode west, toward the edge of maps, where dragons had never flown and kings had never ruled. Some say she died, out there. Some say she found new lands. Some say she sails still, hunting shadows that wear human faces. But those who know, they say the world didn't lose a queen that day. It gained a legend.